Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed, actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it, and we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better. But they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from, so we're not going to cross that.
And
but it's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
how do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? You know, the United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel, because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society. Are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the U.S. and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and the Europeans don't understand this because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the U.S. and Russia, NATO enlargement, U.S. power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the U.S. government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of U.S. dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
For last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly you are an economist, yes? So we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat, that it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States, and what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights, we may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the bad first-class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling, was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. is only 4% of the world population. So it can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy, though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
Originally, the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political. The BRICS started to meet with each other, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, why? Because they had one major thing in common other than being emerging economies, and that was they didn't want the U.S. as the hegemonic power. It was really annoying for all of them to have the United States say, we're the world leader, we're the sole superpower, we're the indispensable country, we make the rules-based system. Which rules? Our rules. So that's what united the BRICS, was annoyance, actually, with the arrogance of U.S. liberal hegemonists or neocons. They made the BRICS. Actually, even it's interesting that Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a very clever strategist for the U.S. power, wrote, when he wrote The Global Chessboard in 1997, he said the one unthinkable thing is for the U.S. to push Russia and China together. But because of American arrogance, that's exactly what America did every day, step by step, for the next 25 years. And that's what made the BRICS. And I think that's what basically unites the BRICS. On the one side, they're united because, well, they're important economies, and the BRICS are now larger than the G7 in purchasing power measured terms. So that's a big deal. But I think the other thing is geopolitical, which is the BRICS really say, we're big powers. We want a multipolar world. We don't want the U.S. surrounding us with military bases. That's the Russian view. That is the Chinese view. Brazil says, come on, don't interfere in South America the way you do, saying we're going to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which was another stupid U.S. idea of the last 10 years. And so Brazil, in a different way, because it's not a superpower like China or Russia, it's not a nuclear power, but it still says, give some space to our region. We don't want the U.S. dictating to us. China's quite interesting because China triangulates. I don't mean China, sorry, India. India is quite interesting because India really triangulates. They have their tensions, even border disputes, of course, with between India and China. And the United States says, okay, we'll be your partner. You just have to oppose China. But India is also, of course, a great civilization. It was colonized by Britain for centuries. And it's not about to say, yes, United States, you run the world. So India fits in this mold in a very interesting way as well, basically as the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's it's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so. And we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West or Western Europe or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. You know, there's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, banks houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one, yeah? So I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe, but the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed and that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, oh, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the number one dumbest idea that I've heard. You know, for NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the BRICS currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the BRICS as the integration can get inspired by Europe, by special drawing rights, probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them? What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the BRICS countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles. They may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF that would help to ensure liquidity among the trading partners within the BRICS and a broader network. But a single currency, I doubt it. One could say, by the way, that there could be something like a BRICS SDR, which is a unit of account, it's a basket, it can serve certain purposes, but it's not really a settlements currency, and it's not really an active transactions currency. So one could imagine something like that, but I don't think we're going to see an actual currency that you can look at or hold in your account that's and use for transactions that's a BRICS currency anytime soon. Maybe I'm out of date and it's going to happen faster, but I think it'll be much more likely that, excuse me, on our phones we'll be able to settle in renminbi, or we'll be able to settle in rupees or reales, rather than a single BRICS currency.
Okay, I want to start with, there's so many subjects I could cover with you, but I actually want to start with COVID and the lab leak and where you started with it in your thinking and just really dismissing the idea of a lab leak, and then having, you partnered actually with Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance to figure out the origins of COVID, and then resulted ultimately in now you thinking that, do you now think it was a lab leak actually?
Oh yeah, most likely.
So how did you, let's start from the beginning. When COVID first emerged and the lab leak theory was being put out there by Donald Trump, and you thought this is, and I agree that this is, when you're pointing the finger at China and you're trying to say they did this to us, that's ultimately trying to march us into a conflict with China. And so I see the fear in that, and I still worry about that a little bit. But what was your thinking in the beginning, and how did you get to the partnership with Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance?
Well, yeah, let me give you some context. I was asked by the British medical journal, The Lancet, which is a global, very distinguished medical journal, to lead a commission on COVID-19 just a few months after the outbreak began. I have a lot of experience in the public policy side of pandemic diseases, and I was one of the architects of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and have had a lot of engagement over the years in public health finance and other public health issues. So the Lancet kindly invited me to chair a commission, and I selected about 25 other commissioners from all over the world, people in the world of politics, in the world of public health, virology, and many areas that are relevant for an epidemic, or in this case, a pandemic, meaning an epidemic that's everywhere in the world. And one of the issues that we needed to look into was where this virus, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, where it came from. And so I instituted a number of task forces as part of this work, about 10 task forces actually. And for the task force on the origins of the virus, I asked Peter Daszak to head that task force and assemble a global group of scientists who would be capable of examining the issue of the origin of COVID. So this was around June 2020, in about 6 months basically after this pandemic had been recognized.
Can I ask you real quick, why were you the one selected to figure this out as an economist? What was it that why did they come to you?
Oh, because the purpose of the commission wasn't just to figure out the origin of the virus. The purpose of the commission was to understand the public policy implications of the first pandemic, really, of this kind in 100 years.
Okay.
This involves urgent financial issues, how to get vaccines or not to people, or medicines or medical supplies, how to address the global cooperation or coordination issues involved. And those are areas where I have expertise. And so I was asked not to be the scientist. I'm an economist. I'm a public policy specialist. And so they asked me to help on the broad issues. And for each of the areas of concern, for example, how does the virus spread? I got specialists in exactly the epidemiology of the disease, some wonderful people from all over the world. In terms of public health measures, I got leaders in public health. And on the issue of where the virus came from, one of the many issues of this commission, I assembled a group of virologists and asked Peter Daszak to head that. Now, why Peter Daszak? Peter Daszak was heading something called EcoHealth Alliance that people all came to know afterwards because it really came into the spotlight. It was an organization that channeled research funds from the US government, tracking in many cases viruses in nature, so going out to places where bats populate the locale, for instance, caves in southwest China in Yunnan province, and looking at the kinds of viruses found there. And I thought, well, this is a guy who knows a lot about nature and transmission of viruses, and so he'd be qualified to lead this group. The way that something like this works is that there's a whole task force, they make a report, and then there's a commission that is above the task force that takes the commission's report and makes a final report, which is what our commission ultimately did. But around June or July 2020, my own view was that there was a little debate, and there were people saying this is pretty strange and this may have been engineered and came from a lab. But I was reading the scientific literature, and the main article appeared in March 2020, an article called Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2. And it appeared in Nature Medicine. That's a very authoritative journal, and this was an article by authoritative scientists, and it said that this virus overwhelmingly likely came from nature, not from a laboratory, and it made several explanations about why it could not have come from a laboratory. And I read it and I believed it. And Tony Fauci referred to this article, and it became, I think, the most read biomedical article of the year because this was a topic everyone wanted to know. And I read it and accepted it. And when others said this came from a lab, I explained to them, you really need to read the background literature on this. And that's pretty much where I was until the fall of 2020. And then there were discordant notes, more voices saying, you know, this really could be from a lab and by serious scientists. Well, that's interesting in and of itself. This wasn't a slam dunk, though that first article seemed to say it was a slam dunk. They really went way far in saying just about nearly irrefutably this came from nature. But I would say still till the end of the year, on the whole, I thought, well, there's a debate, but most diseases do come from nature after all. How many diseases really come from a lab? And it was only in 2021 that a couple of things happened to me. Well, they happened to everybody first, that certain things started to get released by the Freedom of Information Act, by intrepid reporters who were not in the mainstream, by the way, but The Intercept or U.S. Right to Know did wonderful work, because the New York Times was carrying, this is nature, and never anything to the contrary. Science magazine was saying, this is, of course, from Nature, and so forth. But these investigative units used the Freedom of Information Act, and they started to show that there was behind the scenes debate among the experts that we didn't know about. And this was quite a revelation, actually, that, there were meetings on February 1st, 2020, phone calls with Fauci and a number of scientists. And then we started to learn that things were said on those phone calls that were pretty weird, saying, this really looks like came out of a lab, or I don't see how nature did this, or 60-40 lab nature, not at all the public rhetoric, and kept hidden from us. And at that point, a very wonderful small group of scientists took me aside and said, we need to give you a tutorial in virology, Mr. Sachs, to understand what we are seeing about this. And very smart people, and they explained at length how they view this. And they urged me to go back to Dashig, who was heading the task force, and ask him for his research grant from NIH, not a summary of it, but the full grant, which sounded plausible to me because I was starting to see things that I didn't know, such as that Tony Fauci, head of NIH's division on infections and allergic disease, NIAID, was also the head of biodefense for the US. Whoa, I didn't know that. That's something pretty interesting, that the US Defense Department was putting huge amounts of money through Tony Fauci's unit. That raised some question marks. And then pointing out to me some articles by some virologists, all associated with Dashik and others, that said already back in 2005, 2006, the coronavirus was obviously a target for biowarfare, and we needed biodefense, and starting to talk about how this kind of virus could be manipulated as a vector in biowarfare. I said, okay, that's pretty interesting. But then it said to me, this group is doing dangerous research. It's manipulating these viruses. Go look at the research. And they showed me the summary, which was posted, but said, go ask Dashig for the full proposal. And when I did ask Dashig, I was blown away by his answer, because he said to me, oh, Jeff, I can't give you the full proposal. My lawyers say I can't give that to you. And I said, what? Your lawyers? We're a transparent commission. We're trying to investigate this. What do your lawyers have to do with this? Oh, no. Well, this is under Freedom of Information Act lawsuit and so forth. I said, Peter, I need to read this now. And he said, no, I can't give that to you. And I said immediately, well, then you can't head this task force, that's for sure. This is a transparent commission. We are looking for the public will. We're not tied up in lawsuits, and we're not going to be tied up in lawsuits. So I told him to step aside, and he did, but he remained on the commission, but not on that task force for a little while. And two more things happened. One was that the rest of that task force attacked me as, some foe of science, and how dare you, and you, Sachs, you're ignorant, reckless fool, you're buying into this conspiracy theory stuff, and very nasty from people that I've known for a long time. But the second thing was far more interesting, which was another Freedom of Information Act release came, And lo and behold, the people on the task force are co-investigators with Dashig, and they didn't even tell me after I asked them repeatedly, do you have any conflict of interest? So suddenly I see, my God, this is really bad behavior. I ask you straightforwardly, do you have any conflict? They didn't lie. They never answered me until this came out, but they yelled at me. Okay, I don't care about that, except for the fact that the behavior was disgusting and unprofessional. I immediately disbanded that whole task force. And then the biggest thing happened, the biggest thing of all for all of us, which was that a whistleblower posted a research proposal on the Defense Department website of a proposal that had come from Dashig's group and the scientists associated with him called the Diffuse Project proposal. This is extremely interesting, and it gets to the core of the whole issue. And the point is the following. What makes SARS-CoV-2 so infectious, far more infectious than its relative, the original SARS virus? Because the SARS virus, which broke out 2003, 2004, was put out for a basic reason. It didn't become a pandemic. It was scary, but it was controlled because it wasn't so infectious. And in fact, people had to be sick for a long time before they could even transmit it to other people. So SARS-CoV-2 was really infectious. It had a basic reproduction number of 2.4, which means that on average, each infected person of this original Wuhan variety was estimated to infect 2.4 other people. And that's why you get a chain reaction, because as long as that number is bigger than 1, even if you recover, it's 2.4 people that are following up with infection, and they're going to each infect on average 2.4 people. And so it's a chain reaction. So why is that? And that has to do with how this SARS-CoV-2 genome attacks our cells. And one of the ways that it attacks our cells is that it has a stretch of DNA that is not only unusual in this kind of virus, never before seen in this kind of virus. And that stretch is called a furin cleavage site. And it's never been seen in a sarbecovirus, which is a SARS-like virus in this population of this species of bats. So that's why this virus was weird from the start, because what is that furin cleavage site doing? So Kim, the point is that a whistleblower released the Diffuse project. People can find it online. Just Google DARPA Diffuse. And the DARPA Diffuse project said something mind-boggling. It said that at Wuhan, at this Wuhan Institute of Virology, they have, and it says in the text, more than 180 previously unreported SARS-like viruses. And they're going to test them for how effective they are in humans. And they're going to examine specifically whether they have a furin cleavage site. And if they don't have one, they're going to insert one as an experiment to see whether adding the furin cleavage site makes the virus more infectious. Can I say on your show, holy shit? Because that's what this proposal is. Holy shit, what are you doing? You're going to add a furin cleavage site. Well, if you go back to SARS from 2005, it turns out to be fascinating, especially for an economist going back to learn all these things, because this idea of the furin cleavage site as being key to whether or not a virus like this would be highly infectious was already tested back in 2005, 2006, because an experiment was done originally on the SARS virus. Add in a furin cleavage site, and whoa, that thing infects human cells much more easily. So the furin cleavage site wasn't some completely bizarre, unknown thing newly discovered in 2020. It was the object of fascination and interest as a key that would make a SARS-like virus highly infectious. Now, think if you're in biodefense or biowarfare, we don't even know which it is. But that becomes an object of high interest. And the fact of the matter is there are a few labs in the United States that are part of Tony Fauci's, when Tony Fauci headed NIAID, part of his shop that he has funded heavily for a long time that exactly were focused on the furin cleavage site. And what these scientists in the United States had done, and they're very clever, they're brilliant scientists, they had figured out how to insert this furin cleavage site. And they had, in fact, one at the University of North Carolina, who's a central figure in all of this, had figured out the following, which is another mind-boggling thing. Viruses are defined by their DNA like we are. And these viruses have 30,000 nucleotides or base pairs, so-called. And they are RNA viruses, and they have 30,000 long sequences. And those sequences are letters. Those are the nucleotides that make up our DNA and RNA. So they're letters like A, T, G, C, and so on. And what this professor at University of North Carolina figured out how to do, and it's absolutely ingenious, is you give him a sequence of 30,000 letters, and I mean literally just the letters, he will make a live virus from that. He can take the letters and assemble the DNA and insert it into a cell to have it produce the rest of the machinery of the virus, recover the virus, and have a real infectious virus out of a sequence of letters. And what he can also do is not only take that sequence, but say, I'm going to add 12 nucleotides to that 30,000 letter sequence right in this particular place that we've been studying for many years. And those 12 nucleotides code for the furin cleavage site. And I could put that in. That's what it means in the Diffuse project to insert the furin cleavage site. So we have a scientist who's so clever that he can take the sequence of letters, turn it into a virus, make that virus as he wants. And he invented a concept as part of this, he calls it the reverse genetic system, but he invented a concept of what he calls a consensus virus. And a consensus virus is, give me 20 SARS-like viruses, and I'll look at the first position of the viruses, of the RNA or the DNA, the nucleotide, that is the base pair. And 18 of them have a G there, and 2 of them have an A in that spot. And so the consensus is G. So I'm going to take the 20 viruses and I'm going to call the first place a G. Now I'm going to do that 30,000 times. Your computer can do it quite quickly. And I'm going to take the consensus for the second position, third position, all the way up to the 30,000th position. And I'm going to then have a sequence of letters that's 30,000 long. No actual virus in nature is exactly what I just did, but it's kind of smushing together 10 viruses and getting the average of them. And then, because I'm really clever, because I've made this reverse genetic system, I'm going to make an actual virus of a kind that's never been seen before. Okay. Really, truly, in my view, oh my God, because this was unsupervised research. And this was the direct intention of this grant proposal. Bingo, bullseye. And then we're told the following. That was in 2018 that this proposal was made. And then we're told that it was turned down. Don't worry. And I can tell you absolutely the fact that a grant proposal is turned down has almost zero to do whether the research is actually carried out. For a lot of grants, first of all, you submit a proposal to fund things you already did. I'm just telling you, when you put in a grant proposal, maybe 70%, not me, but this is how this biotech world works. You've already done a lot of this research. Now you're trying to get that funded so you can do the next research, so you can get that funded with another grant. So we don't even know whether the work was done previously. But even if it's turned down, you have other grants. You have other research. You have other units. There's another unit, Rocky Mountain Lab, which is kind of wholly owned and operated by Fauci's part of NIH. And it could have done this research. And then suddenly comes a joint article by one of the people at Rocky Mountain Lab and this professor at University of North Carolina. Oh, could be coincidence or could be the real deal. Who knows? We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that a few months later, we have an outbreak. And the outbreak is really strange because it has a furin cleavage site in it and some other things that were part of the research. And it's not years after this thing, it's months after this thing. Right. And then two more things, Kim, if I might. They start talking about the market. This is called the Huanan market in Wuhan. But this is almost surely where the virus was being spread by shoppers sneezing in the market rather than coming from the market, because the timing is wrong. The market outbreak occurred in December, but there's so much reason to believe that the original infection in a human was maybe in October, maybe even earlier. And there are many reasons to believe that.
Yeah.
And then just to finish, to bring us up to date, it's a long-winded answer, but the scientists knew this. Of course they knew this. They knew this February 1st, 2020, that holy shit, this could have been a bad mistake and we're not sure. And they didn't tell us that. They did not tell us that. They lied. And the paper, the proximal origins paper, is almost tantamount to fraud from what we know afterwards. I want to watch my words carefully. I'll say tantamount, but the authors did not tell us what they believed and what they knew, because they could never have written a paper, not a scientific paper, to say in March that the overwhelming weight was that it was natural. And we know from Slack messages now being subpoenaed and other email messages, they had lots of doubts, but they went ahead because one of them said, if it's from a lab, we're never going to be able to prove it, so we may as well argue that it came out of nature. But I think it's darker than that, because I think that the idea was to hide the American role in this. Kim, it's not even a matter of pointing to China. It's a matter of the United States. The cutting edge research was US research. The assembly and reassembly of SARS-like viruses was US research. It broke out in Wuhan, but maybe because a virus concocted in US labs and sent by filter paper to Wuhan was being tested against the bats that they held in captivity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because one idea was to see whether the bats would be infectious to each other in the case of having a furin cleavage site in the sequence. So we don't know to this moment where this came from. And I'll give you three kinds of hypotheses. One is that it is natural, but I think it's very unlikely from what we know, because nothing has checked out on the natural story, and least of all the marketplace. The second is that this was made basically in the US, by the US, as part of an ongoing research program by a lot of very clever scientists who believed everything's safe and under control. And that in the design of this, it was being tested in partnership with China. And so there's definitely a China-US partnership. That's the dash of grants. And that it was being tested in China and accidentally was released from WIV, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. A third possibility is that the research was carried out by US, China, up to the 2018 Diffuse project. It was turned down, and the Chinese went ahead basically on their own to finish the research, which is possible as well. I don't know of the lab leak which of those scenarios is more likely. I'm pretty sure of the following. Sure is a little strong, but I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure of the following: that the furin cleavage site pretty surely was deliberately added to a virus, whether in North Carolina, whether in Wuhan, not sure, and that it got out. And who did it, exactly how, we don't know, but it's really wrong to say, well, this is so much more likely to be in nature. It's really much more likely to be out of a lab.
Yeah.
And by the way, when we say
So-
lab leak, it's important to understand lab manipulation followed by leak. It's not just that it was a natural virus that escaped, but a manipulated virus. And then we've got to bring it up to date, because last week was something absolutely extraordinary. A whistleblower within the CIA has told the House Oversight Committee investigating this that the CIA bribed his team to conclude that this was natural, with, as the House staff said in a press release, with significant monetary incentives. In other words, the CIA bribed its own staff to continue the lying. So this is where we are. It's absolutely a dismaying story. What I can say for sure, now I'm not saying 99.9%, what I can say for sure is that Fauci lied, Francis Collins lied, the US government has lied to us. They may not be sure where it comes from, but they lied about the fact that the evidence was overwhelmingly towards the market cause. I thank you for the chance to share some thoughts with you about Ukraine, and maybe I will be on the briefer side so that we can have some discussion also. I'm following events closely in Ukraine, and I hope elsewhere in the world. It's a very troubling time. I'm very unhappy about U.S. foreign policy, as I said many times during the week of my visit, because I feel that it is dangerous and provocative, and leading us in a very dangerous way. This war in Ukraine is a case in point. It is a war that is essentially a war between the United States and Russia. In which Ukraine is the battleground. It's a war of wills between two superpowers, where the United States wants to incorporate Ukraine fully into the U.S.-led military and economic system, especially NATO, but also other aspects of the U.S.-led system, and in which Russia is asserting that for reasons of fundamental national security as well as national interest, it will not let Ukraine be drawn into the U.S. military alliance. This is at the core of this war. And so far, both sides are playing a game of escalation and chicken, in which each side escalates, daring the other side to escalate, and in which Ukraine suffers more and more grievous disasters as a result of this mutual escalation. But the Ukrainian government is a party to this war also, because it is a Russophobic government that signed on to the idea of defeating Russia with the U.S. backing. This is an impossible goal, literally absolutely impossible, but it is the stated objective and real objective of the Ukrainian government. And so it is a objective that is leading Ukraine to destruction as we speak. The roots of this conflict, of course, go back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the 15 states of the Soviet Union became independent. And Ukraine was early in declaring its independence in 1990. Even before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was a precipitator of the dissolution. But in Ukraine's declaration of independence, and it's in an initial constitution, Ukraine said that it would be a permanently neutral state. And this is very important. Ukraine is the borderland between West and East in Europe. It's a borderland culturally and a borderland politically. It's the dividing line between the Catholic and Protestant West and the Orthodox East. It is a dividing line between the Polish-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking West and the Russian-speaking East. And of course, the word Ukraine itself in Russian means borderland, and it was always viewed by Russia as a protective zone against Western invasions which came repeatedly to Russia, including from Poland in the 16th and 17th centuries, and from Napoleon and from Hitler, that Ukraine was the Western boundary and in effect also a safety zone to some extent for the heartland of Russia. Well, in 1991, the Soviet Union ended. Ukraine became independent and a neutral country that was divided between ethnicities, Ukrainian in the West, Russian in the East. Quite fragile. I was an advisor to the first government of independent Ukraine, and the situation was quite miserable, and the country barely functioned as an independent country. It had been an administrative region of the Soviet Union for 75 years, and for hundreds of years before that, it had been an administrative region of the Russian Empire. So it had never been an independent state for an operational period of time, and it showed. So it was a very difficult start, but it survived the initial few years. And at the beginning of the 1990s, of course, Russia was very vulnerable in financial crisis. And my job as an advisor to President Yeltsin was to try to help to raise Western finance to help Russia to stabilize in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union. I failed completely in that because the United States was implacably opposed to any kind of financial support for Russia in stabilization. And indeed, Russia did not stabilize for almost a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that built up a lot of resentment, of course, but it was even more indicative of the US political attitude, which is that the United States had won the Cold War, and there was no reason to support even the successor state of the Soviet Union that was aiming to become a normal, peaceful, cooperative state in the system. Better to let it be weak, let it fail, and for the United States to enjoy its unipolar power that came with the demise of its foe. And this was the US attitude I came to discover, and I really disliked it from the beginning because it's an attitude of arrogance and ignorance, and it came back to haunt the United States in this arrogance. But one of the first actions of the US in this new unipolar environment was the expansion of NATO. And this, of course, came despite the explicit promises that had been made by the US government and the German government to President Gorbachev in 1990 that with the end of the Soviet military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage. And so it would be safe for Germany to unify because NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, to use the phrase that James Baker used in 1990 with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev said, yes, that is essential, that NATO not expand. Gorbachev was very trusting. He was a person of peace. The United States is very duplicitous. And as soon as they had the opportunity, they broke the promises and indeed declared, we never made any promises at all. This is the US way. So by 1992, the United States started to plan the expansion of NATO. And this was controversial within the US government because there were parts of the US government that were opposed to breaking the promise that had been made. And most notably in the Clinton administration, the Secretary of Defense, William Perry, was opposed to NATO enlargement and even considered resigning in 1995 over this push for NATO enlargement. But President Clinton decided to expand NATO. I think this was basically a decision of the US security apparatus, but it was combined with a lot of lobbying in the United States by the military companies, especially Raytheon, which led the lobbying effort, and also by the Polish American community, the Czech American community, the Hungarian American community, which pressed for NATO enlargement. Now, as you know, NATO enlarged in 2 big waves. First, in the end of the 1990s to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And Russia was quite unhappy about this, but not vociferously unhappy because those are countries in Central Europe. They are not on the Russian border, and they are not the most sensitive spots for Russia. But in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski published the plan for NATO enlargement in Foreign Affairs magazine when he laid out a timeline in which the first wave would be Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and the second wave would be the Baltic states and the littoral states of the Black Sea, Bulgaria and Romania, and the third wave would be Ukraine and Georgia. And according to Brzezinski, that third wave would come in 2005 to 2010. And the US followed that timeline. In 2004, NATO expanded by 7 more countries, the 3 Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And in 2008, famously, the Bush administration insisted at the Bucharest NATO summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members. And Russia was very, very strongly saying, don't do that, saying this is our absolute red line. Putin made an important speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 when he said that this NATO enlargement needed to stop. And in 2008, he told George Bush in Bucharest that if US goes ahead, it would mean war. And of course, the United States went ahead because the defining feature of US foreign policy is that it cannot hear any other country's red line. To do so is defeatist, appeasement. And so the US doesn't listen anymore to anybody. And that remains true until today, I'm afraid. So in 2010, President Viktor Yanukovych won the election and called for neutrality of Ukraine. But in 2013, when he resisted signing an association roadmap with the European Union, saying that it had to be delayed because Russia was objecting to parts of it, a protest broke out that was heavily stoked by the United States. So the US poured in a tremendous amount of money and organizational effort and media support to stoke the protests in the Maidan demonstrations. And I know some of that firsthand because one of the leading NGOs explained to me how much American money was flowing into supporting the demonstrations. In January 2014, the US Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, spoke with the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, on the phone, and the phone call was intercepted by the Russians and posted online, and it showed the two of them discussing who would be the post-Yanukovych government in Kiev. They were plotting regime change, basically, is the only way to put it. And their call was around January 27th, and the Yanukovych government fell on the 22nd of February, so about 3.5 weeks later. But the US was planning for the overthrow of Yanukovych, which in the end came violently with the right-wing paramilitaries led by nationalist, anti-Russian Ukrainian paramilitary forces with the US support. And Yanukovych fled, and the United States recognized the new government the first day, and Russia basically saw that this was the start of war. And within a few weeks, Russia had retaken Crimea in response, because Russia's naval base is in Sevastopol, of course, as it has been since the year 1783. So this goes back 240 years now as the site of Russia's naval base, and Russia was in no mood to let the United States take over Russia's naval base in the Black Sea. So the war broke out in February 2014, and the United States began to pour in armaments. And part of the Ukraine military, the Russian-speaking Eastern forces, mutinied and declared autonomy of the Russian eastern regions. And so a civil war broke out within Ukraine that really was a civil war. Putin was not the author of those breakaway forces. That was an internal civil war that began. And the United States supported the Western Ukraine government now in power in Kiev. And though two agreements were negotiated, the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, to reestablish peace internally in Ukraine based on autonomy of the eastern regions, Lugansk and Donetsk. The Ukrainian government, with the strong support of the United States, rejected implementation of those agreements. And that's also quite interesting because the Minsk II agreement was unanimously backed by the UN Security Council, but this had absolutely no effect on US foreign policy, which again truly does not care at all about a UN Security Council vote. And the US urged Ukraine not to implement the agreement, which was very much in line with the Ukrainian government's view. At the same time, France and Germany were guarantors of the Minsk II agreement, and they also provided no impetus or advocacy for the implementation of the agreements. And the combination of the military coup, the arming of Ukraine by the United States, and the failure of the Minsk II agreements, of course, poisoned the diplomacy, so that the situation between the United States and Russia was very fraught by the end of the 2010s. But surprisingly to me, and alarmingly to me, everything became far worse when President Biden came to office, because Biden came in even more unilateralist and neoconservative than Trump. And this was a big surprise to me. Unilateralist, I mean in the sense of the United States demanding its way, whether in Asia or in Europe, of course, appealing to allies to support the U.S. as the leader and to get in line with the U.S. So unlike Trump, Biden appeals to allies for an alliance, but Biden was even more aggressive against China and against Russia than Trump. And this was a big surprise to me politically, actually. And I don't quite understand it because politically I've been a Democratic Party voter for decades. But now I find that the point of view that I have in foreign policy, which was an anti-war point of view and used to be a dominant or at least a major part of Democratic Party politics, even though the party was always divided between hawks and doves, now doesn't exist. The party is almost entirely hawkish in orientation. So when Biden came in, he took a very aggressive position that NATO will enlarge, that the U.S. will increase its funding for armaments in Ukraine, and that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. And this is quite important to understand. It's formal NATO policy and formal American policy that the issue of NATO enlargement involves only the NATO countries and the candidate country, but no other country has any say in the matter of enlargement, and specifically that Russia has no say in the question of NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. That is entirely within NATO and between NATO and Ukraine and Georgia. But when Russia objects, there is no basis for negotiation with Russia over those issues because NATO has no responsibility to any other country about where it is based and how it enlarges. And so 2021 was a very difficult period. Of course, it was also the COVID period, but it was a period of rising tensions between the United States and China and the United States and Russia. And at the end of 2021, on December 17, Russia put forward a draft proposal for U.S.-Russia security arrangements, which called for an end to NATO enlargement and a limitation on the placement of missiles of the United States in areas close to the Russian border. The United States flatly rejected any negotiation over these issues and replied formally to Russia in January 2022 that it would not negotiate on the question of NATO. On February 21st, 2022, the Russian Security Council met, and in the minutes that are online, President Putin asks Minister Lavrov for a statement of the state of negotiations or diplomacy over Russia's security concerns, and Lavrov declares that the negotiations have failed because the Americans have replied that there are no grounds for negotiation over these issues. And President Putin gave an address to the Russian people explaining that we have not been heard, we are left with no alternative, and Russia's invasion took place on February 24th, 2022. It was just 1 week later that Zelensky declared publicly that Ukraine would consider neutrality as a potential way to stop the war. And quite interestingly, in early March 2022, negotiations began between Russia and Ukraine just about 2 weeks after the start of the special military operation. And these negotiations were hosted by Turkey. And they made good progress for a couple of weeks. And in fact, the two sides were coming close to an agreement based on Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. But the United States intervened and explained to Ukraine that it should fight instead of conceding neutrality, and that the U.S. would increase the arms shipments to Ukraine, including major weapon systems like the HIMARS, and that Ukraine would defeat Russia through a combination of the NATO weaponry and the Western sanctions. And so Ukraine told Turkey that it was suspending negotiations, and it declared publicly that there would be no negotiations until Ukraine had recaptured all of the territory taken by Russia, including Crimea. Now, the most basic point is Ukraine cannot achieve this militarily under any circumstances, in my opinion, because if it did achieve a military breakthrough against Russia, as unlikely as that is, Russia would escalate to the point of nuclear weapons. And this is the fundamental flaw in the military approach from the beginning. Russia views the conflict as an existential conflict. The United States views it as a nice conflict because first, it doesn't involve U.S. Troops at all. Second, it weakens Russia. So the U.S. is quite comfortable with the conflict. As long as the Ukrainians want to fight, the U.S. will be happy to arm them. But for Russia, this is existential. And so the Ukrainian war aims are, in my opinion, tragic, completely unachievable, and doomed, therefore, to fail. But the United States is under no pressure to resolve that paradox or that conflict between stated goals and reality, because it's not American soldiers on the ground. It's only American weapon systems, and the U.S. is more than happy to provide them. And by U.S., I mean the security apparatus and the Congress. The American people are not very happy, but no one is asking them their opinion about this. So to just draw this to a conclusion, we are now a year and a half after the launch of the Russian invasion. We are 9 years after the start of the war, and there are still basically there is still a fundamental impasse in that the United States position is that NATO will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia's position is it will never enlarge to Ukraine. And we have an ongoing war of attrition that every day claims around 1,000 Ukrainian deaths and massive destruction of Ukraine, and a political impasse because the U.S. Takes the view that any concession on these issues would make the U.S. look weak compared to China, would lead to the administration being attacked by the hawks inside the U.S. And so the U.S. position is continue to escalate and do not make any concessions on NATO issues. Russia's view is that Russia will fight a war of attrition and that it has sufficient friends in China, India, Brazil, Africa, that it is not isolated and that it can carry on this war until Ukraine runs out of young men. And so Russia's feeling is that this is a war that could go on for a long time and, if necessary, would escalate. So day by day, we have this continuing disastrous war of attrition, and no public voices in the United States, in the political circles, calling for any alternative at all. Well, that's not quite true. Trump is saying, I'll end the war in one day. And it could be true because Trump wouldn't care about NATO enlargement. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who will be a real annoyance to Biden next year during the primary season, says this is an unnecessary war and we should negotiate. But in the Congress and in the administration, all voices publicly are, we will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes to achieve Ukraine's objectives. The Ukrainians, at least by that I mean the current political leadership, is of course profoundly dug in. It is said that if Zelensky said that he wanted to negotiate, he'd probably be killed, and that is quite possible, or taken out. So the Ukrainians are not any source of negotiating breakthrough at all. And so this is the impasse. It's profoundly dangerous and illogical and destructive. And all of the logic says that we should end this through a absolutely basic and sensible agreement, in my view, which is the United States should say we never should have pushed for NATO enlargement. We should have let Ukraine be neutral and safer as a result. And if Russia will go home, we will stop arming Ukraine, and Ukraine will become neutral and receive its guarantees in other ways through a public treaty and the UN Security Council, and monitored withdrawals of troops on all sides and weaponry on all sides. And that's how it should end. But it could be a long time before that happens because of the political dynamics that I've described. So let me stop there. That's my view of the situation. Of course, you can see I'm rather profoundly unhappy with U.S. foreign policy, which I think knows how to make more trouble than it solves. It's very provocative. It's very dangerous. It does not estimate risks well, and it catches other countries in a lot of trouble because it puts them in the middle of great power confrontations. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you.